And so in this preliminary diagnosis, these 3 chapters, 2, 3, and 4 of Isaiah, there is a number of symptoms that the prophet points out to us. And for the sake of time and to just the limitation of scope, I'm going to narrow it down to 3 symptoms that we see here in these passages. I could do a bunch of other ones, and there certainly are many more, but I'm going to narrow it down to these 3 symptoms that show up when we defy the glorious presence of the Lord. Here they are, and then we're going to work through them one at a time. We're going to look at the symptom of oppression. Oppression, which is certainly a relevant and contemporary term, isn't it? Indeed. That'll be number 1. Second of all, we'll look at materialism, also very relevant and present to us in our society today. And then third, we're going to look at vanity, which is very closely tied to materialism. They're both, of course, the love of self or the love of one's possession. So these 3 things we're going to look at this morning. Oppression, or you might want to call it power mongering, just the desire for power, materialism, and vanity. If any of those 3 symptoms show up in your life or your family or your nation, it's probably a sign that the disease, the malignant tumor of defying his glorious presence is already manifest in your spiritual constitution. So let's look first of all at oppression, and we see this in verse 5. So Bible's open. Let's do some work in the scriptures together this morning. He identifies it by name. Look at verse 5. And the people will oppress one another, and every one his fellow, and every one his neighbor. The youth will be insolent to the elder, and the despised to the honorable. That's not the only time Isaiah mentions oppression in these sections. Flip forward, if you will, to chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where we're going to see it there as well. The Lord, he says in verse 14, will enter into judgment with the elders and the princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding their face? The face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts. And so notice here that Isaiah specifically identifies as guilty of the sin of oppression the elders and the princes. And so we might say this, that oppression is usually a top-down sort of sin, isn't it? Oppression is the type of sin that those who are on top afflict upon those who are underneath them. And he calls out the elders, which would be the religious leaders, and terrifying to those of us who are elders, literally elders in the church, like myself. And he calls out the princes, which we might take as the civil or the magisterial, the governmental leaders. So oppression is sort of a top-down sin where you crush those who are weaker than you. But you don't have to be an elder or a priest. You can do it in practically any context in which you happen to have privilege or priority or title or rank or power over somebody underneath you. I remember when I was on the wrestling team in high school, we played this game called King of the Mat. You started with the 2 smallest guys, and they would wrestle, and the winner stayed up out on the mat, and the other guy had to go back to the end of the line, and then the next biggest guy would come out, and the next, and the next, and the winner would always stay out, and the goal was always to destroy the weaklings. We didn't even matter what weight class you were in. The stronger, the better, the more powerful would try to knock down those who are weaker or smaller than him. And that's essentially what happens in oppression. Here's my definition of it. I'll define the word for you. What do I mean by oppression? Oppression is the ungodly desire to rule over others, treating them as less than human in order to manipulate, to control, to dominate, so as to better one's own status and possessions at the direct expense of others. That's the definition right there. So anytime you crush somebody else for your own betterment, whether it's in the workplace or whatever it is, family situations, to your betterment and to their expense, that's a generic definition of oppression. Now, let's get contemporary, shall we? Oppression is probably the most talked about societal sin today. If you go to the university, it'll be about one day before you hear somebody telling you about oppression. Oppression is preached in politics. Oppression is preached in Hollywood. But there is a fundamental problem with the kinds of oppression that our society likes to talk about. And the fundamental problem and the kinds of oppression that our society enjoys most to talk about is that it is an atheistic, version, an atheistic, secular understanding of oppression that entirely omits the God factor, entirely, right? And so therefore, by eliminating the God factor entirely, it doesn't begin with the fundamental and presuppositional beginning point that all human beings bear the very image of God, the imago Dei. And so usually secular or atheistic discussions on oppression are off from the get-go. They're off from step one because they ignore the rulership and the authority and the sovereignty of God, and they completely ignore the image of God in man. And so here's what happens with most discussions on oppression, is that they are immediately politicized. You know what I'm talking about, right? They're used as a tool. They're used as a weapon. They're used as a form of manipulation. And so ironically, here's the irony, is that most discussions on oppression actually turn out to be oppressive in themselves. Okay, because they don't begin from the fundamental beginning point that we do as Bible-believing Christians. Now let's just call out a few of these societal sins of oppression, shall we? Let's start with racism. Of course, racism is wicked. I would be embarrassed if I were to find out that anyone in our congregation ever acted overtly in a racist way. We should obviously love people of all kinds and differences, languages, backgrounds. Of course, racism is wicked, but here's the thing. It's not the only form of oppression in our society today. In fact, there are many. So is rioting. Rioting is wicked. Destroying another man's business, which he's worked his whole life to build up. To coerce through fear and violence is another form of manipulation and control. Here's a question for you. What does abortion and police brutality and excessive taxation and unconstitutional lockdowns and big tech censorship and gerrymandering and corporate greed and dead people voting all have in common? What do they all have in common, whether it's from the left or from the right? Here's what they have in common. In every one of those things, what the person that is doing it is saying is, I'm God here, and I will create the world that I want to rule over. And so, look, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that both Democrats and Republicans, blacks and whites and every color in between, gays and straights, men and women, can all be tempted to oppress their enemies and their rivals, to crush them in order to gain power, or if they have it, to maintain it? Is that possible? Of course the answer is yes. Because secular discussions on oppression always miss the main factor, which is that it is a sin of the heart. It is not primarily political. It is, first of all, a spiritual problem, a problem of the heart. Notice what Isaiah says in verse 5. He says, and the people will oppress one another, everyone his fellow and everyone his neighbors. In other words, there's nobody who's exempted from this temptation. The temptation is there, whether you have much power or whether you have little. Even if you have no power at all, your temptation is going to be the reverse, to resent those who do have power and to take it from them if possible. And so oppression is something that's going to be a temptation to every one of us in the room in various contexts and in various ways. It's not limited to Madison Avenue boardrooms and presidential Oval Offices. It's not limited to king's chambers as though that were the only place it could be found. But no, oppression is any cruel desire to step over another human being, to use them, to manipulate them as though they were some sort of an obstacle to your getting the way you want and to obtaining the power that you desire. And so oppression can be found on the Senate floor, yes, of course. In the gym locker room, though, also too, yes. Oval Office, just as well as it can be found on the school bus or the cheerleading squad or the homeschooling circle. Even the presbytery meeting, believe it or not, can be subject to these forms of power maneuvers and manipulation. And they're all attempts for the individual to say, I will be Lord here. And Isaiah would say, no, you will stand down. You are a mere creature. God is God. And so the very definition of oppression is any time you treat any other human being as a means rather than an end, or if you treat them as a tool rather than a treasure, because the very essence, the quintessence of oppression is to neglect the image of God in one another, It says, I will be Lord, and Isaiah would say, stop, stand down, stop controlling, stop dominating, stop hurting people. And by the way, what's the opposite of oppression? Could you think of what that opposite might be? Encouragement, edification, compassion, love. And so before you, look, this would be so easy to do. It'd be so easy to simply preach a sermon on oppression and point out your political adversary. Anybody could do that. And probably many have tried. But the real difficulty with oppression is to look into the heart and say, how do I, as an individual, use people as tools to acquire what I want? That's what Isaiah would point out and is relevant to all of us here in this morning. Now, the reason that oppression is wicked, of course, is that it defies the glorious presence of God. That's what Isaiah said, right, in the verse. Defies the glorious presence of God by defying and denying the image of God